New York City. At the turn of the century wasn't the shimmering skyline of modern postcards. It was a suffocating labyrinth of tenements, a sprawling forest of clotheslines and coal smoke, where the American dream often came to die in the gutter. In 1906, a 9-year-old boy named Salvatore Lucania stepped off a rusted steamship from Sicily, his lungs stinging with the salty air of the harbor. He didn't bring family wealth or a trade. He brought an insatiable appetite that the overcrowded streets of the Lower East Side were never meant to satisfy. By the time he was 14, he wasn't just skipping school. He was running a protection racket, charging other children a penny a day for safe passage. If they didn't pay, they didn't just get a bruised ego, they got a fist to the jaw. This wasn't mere adolescent rebellion. It was the birth of a cold, calculated predator. Lucania, who would soon reinvent himself as Charles Lucky Luciano, looked at the world through a different lens than his peers. While the old-school Mafia bosses, the Mustache Petes, clung to archaic notions of Sicilian honor, blood feuds, and omertà, Lucky saw a spreadsheet. He looked at the chaos of the city and saw a massive waste of resources. To him, the traditional underworld was inefficient, governed by egos and ancient grudges that got in the way of the only thing that truly mattered, the bottom line. He wasn't interested in being a neighborhood king. He wanted to be a CEO of a global enterprise. By the late 1920s, New York had become a powder keg. Two warring titans, Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano, were tearing the city apart in the Castellamarese War. Bodies were dropping in the streets, and the constant heat from the NYPD was becoming bad for business. Luciano, then a high-ranking lieutenant under Masseria, watched the mounting body count with a chilling lack of empathy. He didn't see glory in the struggle. He saw a failing business model. On April 15, 1931, the wind off the Atlantic carried a sharp bite as Luciano invited Masseria to a midday meal at Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island. They ate lobster, drank heavy red wine, and played a game of cards. It was a scene of domestic tranquility in a world of violence. Then, Lucky excused himself to the restroom. It was the oldest play in the book, yet it worked with lethal precision. While Lucky stood at the sink, 4 gunmen, a lethal quartet including the likes of Bugsy Siegel and Vito Genovese, burst through the doors and turned the restaurant into a slaughterhouse. Masseria died on the floor, his blood pooling on the linoleum, a silent witness in the form of an ace of spades clutched in his lifeless hand. But Luciano's vision went far beyond a simple coup. Within months, he orchestrated the elimination of the remaining titan, Maranzano. The age of the boss of all bosses was dead. In its place, Luciano engineered the most significant structural change in the history of American crime, the Commission. He gathered the heads of the 5 New York families and regional bosses from across the country. He didn't offer them a throne, he offered them a seat at a boardroom table. This was the corporate restructuring of American sin. He divided territories, established a national syndicate, and instituted a system of arbitration to replace the gun. Crime was no longer a series of street brawls. It was a multinational corporation with its own internal judiciary. By 1935, Luciano moved through the Waldorf Astoria like a legitimate tycoon, draped in bespoke silk suits, his face a mask of high-functioning psychopathy. He had successfully insulated himself behind layers of bureaucracy, making him seemingly untouchable. The ledgers were clean, the orders were whispered, and the violence was outsourced. He thought he had perfected the game. But in the shadows of a Mahogany Row office, a young, relentlessly ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey was beginning to pull at a single, frayed thread. A thread that didn't lead to a murder or a heist, but to something much more sordid, hidden behind the closed doors of New York's Underworld, waiting to drag the chairman of the board into the light. That light took the form of Thomas Dewey. While Luciano was busy drafting the blueprints for the commission, a corporate board of directors designed to end the messy street wars of the 1920s, Dewey was cataloging the human cost of that efficiency. By 1931, Lucky had done the unthinkable. He had swept away the mustache Petes, the old-world dons obsessed with vendettas and village honor, and replaced them with a boardroom. 5 families in New York, a national syndicate across the states, all operating with the cold precision of a Fortune 500 company. Luciano was the chairman, a high-functioning architect of chaos who preferred a ledger to a Luger. He believed that if you shared the wealth, you shared the peace. To the public, he was a ghost in a silk suit, dining at the Waldorf Astoria, seemingly light years away from the street-level thuggery. Enter Thomas Dewey. If Luciano was the dark king of the shadows, Dewey was the burning sun of the law. He was a man with a mustache as sharp as his legal mind, and an ambition that could swallow Manhattan whole. Dewey didn't care about the romanticized code of silence. He cared about results. He knew he couldn't pin the high-profile hits on Luciano. The bodies were buried too deep, and the witnesses were too dead. So, he looked for the rot where it was most visible: the vice dens. In the mid-1930s, New York's underworld ran on the broken backs of thousands of women. Prostitution was a sprawling, decentralized mess until Luciano's lieutenants moved in to organize it. They applied the corporate model to the oldest profession, taxing every house, every madam, and every girl. It was a gold mine of misery. For Dewey, this was the frayed thread. He didn't just see a social ill, he saw a paper trail. On a cold night in February 1936, Dewey launched a blitzkrieg. Over 100 police officers descended on 80 brothels simultaneously. It wasn't a search for drugs or guns, it was a harvest of voices. He arrested hundreds of women, but he didn't treat them like criminals. He treated them like leverage. In the sterile, high-pressure environment of the prosecutor's office, the silent witnesses began to talk. These weren't the hardened button men of the Mafia. These were women like Cokie Flo Brown, who had been discarded by the system and saw a chance for a different kind of survival. As the trial approached, the city watched in a fever dream. The chairman of the board was being dragged into a courtroom not for a grand conspiracy or a political assassination, but for the exploitation of women on the street. Luciano sat at the defense table, his face a mask of bored indifference. He viewed Dewey's case as a joke, a desperate reach by a grandstanding politician. He believed his hierarchy, the layers of middle management he'd built, would insulate him. He was the god of an invisible empire. Surely he couldn't be toppled by the testimony of social outcasts. But the air in that courtroom was thick with a new kind of tension. Dewey wasn't just presenting evidence. He was dismantling a myth. He presented the ledger of human suffering as a balance sheet of Luciano's personal greed. For the first time, the Lucky moniker seemed like a cruel irony. The prosecution didn't need a smoking gun when they had a chorus of ghosts. The jury retreated, and the silence that followed was deafening. Luciano, the man who had outsmarted every rival and survived every ambush, waited in his cell, confident that his empire was too vast to fall. But as the clock in the courthouse ticked toward a verdict, a shadow was falling over the chairman that no amount of influence could block. The law was about to strike, but the world was also about to change. As the judge prepared to read the sentence, a much larger conflict was brewing across the Atlantic, one that would soon force the United States government to make a deal with the very devil they were trying to bury. The gavel fell in 1936 with the weight of a guillotine. Thomas Dewey had done the impossible. By flipping the very women Luciano had commodified, the working girls who were the invisible cogs in his machine, The prosecution pierced the armor of the chairman. Charles Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in Dannemora, a cold, desolate fortress near the Canadian border known as Siberia. To the public, the king was dead. To Luciano, this was merely a temporary restructuring of the firm. While the world burned in the fires of World War II, the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence faced a crisis. The New York waterfront was a sieve for German sabotage. They needed a gatekeeper. They needed the man in the cell. In a chilling display of pragmatism over morality, the government brokered Operation Underworld. Luciano leveraged his absolute control over the longshoremen to secure the docks and provided crucial intelligence for the Allied invasion of Sicily. The devil didn't just have a seat at the table. He was holding the map for the highest levels of the American military. In 1946, the debt was paid. Luciano's sentence was commuted on the condition of permanent deportation. As his ship, the Laura C., pulled away from the Brooklyn skyline, he wasn't a broken man. He was an expanding enterprise. From his exile in Italy, Luciano didn't retire. He diversified. He looked at the chaos of post-war Europe and saw a vacuum. Using his vast network and the silent witnesses of his ledgers, he laid the groundwork for what would become the French Connection. He streamlined the flow of Southeast Asian opium through Marseille and into the veins of American cities. He was the invisible hand, the high-functioning sociopath who traded in blood and white powder with the cold, calculating efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO. Luciano's mind was his greatest weapon, a biological supercomputer devoid of empathy but overflowing with strategy. He replaced the archaic mustache Petes who settled scores with shotguns with a commission that settled scores with balance sheets. He understood that a dead body was a liability, but a corrupted official was an asset. This was the birth of the modern syndicate, a shadow government with its own laws, its own tax system, and its own executioners. On January 26, 1962, at the Naples International Airport, the clock finally ran out. Federal agents were closing in, preparing to arrest him for his role in a global heroin ring. As he walked to meet a film producer to discuss a movie about his life, his heart, the only thing he couldn't negotiate with, betrayed him. At 64, Charles Lucky Luciano collapsed on the cold tile of the terminal. The forensic report was clinical, a myocardial infarction, a natural end for a man whose life was anything but natural. His body was eventually allowed back into the United States, buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, just miles from the streets he once owned. But the ghost of Luciano never left the boardrooms of organized crime. He didn't just lead the Mafia, he redesigned it for the modern age. He proved that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, but the ones wearing tailored suits, smiling at the camera, and treating the world like a game of chess where everyone else is just a pawn to be sacrificed. The empire he built remains a blueprint for every cartel and syndicate that followed, a chilling reminder that while the man died on a terminal floor, his shadow still stretches across every corner of the global underworld. Even now, in the silence between the sirens, the chairman is still watching.